The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty settlement of Cedar Ridge, as Sarah Mitchell hung wet clothes on the line behind her small cabin. At 19, she had already known more hardship than most women twice her age. Her father had died the previous winter from fever, leaving her alone in the harsh frontier territory of New Mexico. The sound of approaching horses made her freeze. Through the gaps in the wooden fence, she could see a group of Apache warriors riding toward the settlement. Their painted faces and war paint told her this was not a peaceful visit. Sarah's heart pounded as she remembered the stories the other settlers had whispered about recent raids on nearby homesteads. She dropped the wet shirt she was holding and ran toward her cabin, but it was too late. The warriors had already surrounded the small building. The leader, a tall man with fierce dark eyes and intricate tattoos covering his muscular arms, dismounted from his horse and walked slowly toward her. "Please," Sarah whispered, backing against the wooden wall of her home. "I have nothing of value. My father is dead and I am alone." The Apache leader studied her with an intensity that made her shiver. He spoke in his native language to the other warriors, who laughed and made comments she could not understand. Sarah knew enough about frontier life to realize that being taken by raiders usually meant a fate worse than death. "You come with us," the leader said in broken English, his voice deep and commanding. Sarah looked around desperately. The other cabins in the settlement seemed empty. Most of the men were out working the fields or hunting, and the women and children had likely hidden when they saw the approaching war party. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. "I beg you," she said, her voice trembling as tears began to fall down her cheeks. "I will not be one of them. Take me as your own." The words surprised even her as they left her mouth. She had heard stories of white women who were adopted into Apache tribes rather than killed or enslaved. It was a desperate gamble, but it might be her only chance at survival. The Apache leader stopped walking and tilted his head, studying her face carefully. His dark eyes seemed to look right through her, as if he could see into her very soul. The other warriors fell silent, waiting to see what their leader would decide. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the dry grass and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Sarah held her breath, knowing that her fate hung in the balance of this man's decision. Finally, the leader spoke again, this time in his own language. One of the other warriors, a younger man with scars across his chest, stepped forward and began to argue with him. Their voices grew louder and more heated as they gestured towards Sarah. She could not understand their words, but she could sense the tension between them. The younger warrior seemed angry, perhaps jealous or disapproving of his leader's apparent interest in her plea. The argument continued for several minutes, while Sarah pressed herself against the cabin wall, too terrified to move. She watched as other warriors joined the discussion, some seeming to support their leader while others sided with the scarred young man. Then another voice cut through the debate. A second group of Apache warriors had arrived, led by a man who appeared to be even more important than the first leader. This new arrival was older, with gray streaking his long black hair and eyes that held the wisdom of many battles. The two leaders began to speak in hushed tones, while the other warriors waited respectfully. Sarah realized that her fate was now being decided by men whose culture and motivations she could barely comprehend. As they talked, she noticed something that gave her a flicker of hope. The first leader, the one who had initially approached her, kept glancing in her direction with what almost seemed like protective concern. When the younger warrior made another angry comment and pointed at her aggressively, the leader stepped between them, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. The message was clear without any words being spoken. Whatever the first leader had decided about Sarah, he was prepared to defend that decision against anyone who challenged it, even his own warriors. The older, more senior leader studied Sarah for a long moment, then nodded slowly and spoke a few words to the first leader. The decision had been made, though Sarah still had no idea what that decision was or what it would mean for her future. The first leader walked back toward her, his expression unreadable. Sarah's legs felt weak and she wondered if these might be her last moments alive. But when he reached her, instead of drawing his weapon, he extended his hand. "You come," he said simply. "You mine now." Sarah's hand shook as she stared at the outstretched hand of the Apache leader. Behind him, she could see the younger warrior with scars across his chest growing more agitated. His eyes burned with anger as he watched the exchange between his leader and the white woman. "My name is Nelnish," the leader said quietly, his English careful but clear. "You will learn our ways." Sarah slowly reached out and took his hand. The moment their skin touched, the scarred warrior erupted in furious Apache words. His voice grew louder and more violent as he gestured wildly at Sarah, and then at Nalnish. Nalnish released Sarah's hand and turned to face the angry warrior. The tension between the two men was electric, like the air before a thunderstorm. Sarah could see that this was about more than just her fate. There was something deeper at stake between these two men. The scarred warrior, who Sarah would later learn was called Goyal, stepped closer to Nalnish and spoke in a low, threatening tone. Even without understanding the language, Sarah could tell he was challenging his leader's authority. The other warriors formed a loose circle around the two men, their faces grave. This was clearly a serious breach of tribal protocol. In Apache culture, directly challenging a war leader in front of his men was a dangerous act that could have deadly consequences. Nalnish's hand moved to the tomahawk at his side, but he did not draw it. Instead, he spoke in measured tones, his voice carrying the weight of command. Sarah watched as several of the other warriors nodded in agreement with whatever he was saying. But Goyal was not satisfied. He pointed at Sarah again and spoke words that sounded like curses. Then, to everyone's shock, he drew his own knife and took a step toward her. The movement was fast, but Nalnish was faster. Before Goyal could take another step, Nalnish had moved between them, his own blade gleaming in the sunlight. The two men stood frozen for a moment, weapons drawn, staring into each other's eyes. "She is mine," Nalnish said in English, his voice carrying clearly across the settlement. Though he spoke the words to Goyal, Sarah understood they were meant for all the warriors to hear and understand. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Finally, the older leader who had arrived with the second group spoke sharply to both men. His voice carried the unmistakable tone of absolute authority. Both warriors slowly lowered their weapons, but the hatred in Goyal's eyes had not diminished. If anything, it had grown stronger. Sarah realized that by accepting Nalnish's protection, she had made a dangerous enemy. Nalnish turned back to her and gestured toward his horse. "We go now," he said. Sarah looked back at her cabin, at the few possessions that represented her entire life in the settlement. She thought of the small wooden cross her mother had given her, hidden under her mattress, and the letters from her cousin in Kansas that she would never be able to answer. "My things," she said hesitantly. Nalnish shook his head. "Old life finished. New life begins." He helped her onto his horse, swinging up behind her with fluid grace. As they rode away from Cedar Ridge, Sarah looked back one last time at the only home she had known since coming west with her father. The group of warriors rode in formation across the desert landscape, with Nalnish and Sarah near the front, and Goyal deliberately positioning himself as far away as possible. The older leader rode beside them for a while, speaking quietly with Nalnish in their native language. After several hours of travel, they stopped near a small stream to rest the horses and take water. Sarah's legs were cramped from riding and her throat was parched. She had never ridden for so long without a break. Nalnish helped her down from the horse and led her to the stream. As she knelt to drink, she became aware that several of the warriors were watching her curiously. She realized that most of them had probably never seen a white woman up close before. One of the younger warriors, barely more than a boy, approached and spoke to Nalnish. The leader nodded and said something that made the boy smile. Then he turned to Sarah. "Husky asks what color your hair is when sun shines through it," Nalnish translated. Sarah touched her brown hair self-consciously. In the bright desert sun, she knew it probably showed reddish highlights that would be unfamiliar to people with black hair. "Tell him it changes color in different light," she said. When Nalnish translated her response, several of the warriors laughed, but not unkindly. For the first time since the morning's events began, Sarah felt a tiny spark of hope that she might survive this ordeal. But as they prepared to mount their horses again, she caught sight of Goyal watching her from across the stream. His expression was cold and calculating, and she had the unsettling feeling that he was planning something that would not end well for her. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as they continued their journey deeper into Apache territory. Sarah had no idea where they were going or what would happen when they arrived, but she knew there was no turning back now. The Apache village appeared in the distance like a mirage, tucked into a hidden canyon where red rock walls provided natural protection from enemies and the harsh desert winds. As they rode closer, Sarah could see dozens of traditional dwellings scattered throughout the canyon floor, with smoke rising from cook fires and children playing in the dusty spaces between homes. The arrival of the war party caused immediate excitement in the village. Women emerged from their homes and children ran alongside the horses, chattering excitedly in Apache. But as word spread that Nalnish had brought a white woman with him, the mood shifted to one of curiosity mixed with suspicion. Sarah felt dozens of eyes watching her as Nalnish helped her down from his horse. She had never felt so exposed and vulnerable in her life. Her simple cotton dress, practical for frontier life, looked painfully out of place among the beautifully crafted leather clothing worn by the Apache women. An elderly woman with intricate silver jewelry and deep lines etched into her weathered face approached them. She spoke rapidly to Nalnish, her tone suggesting she was not entirely pleased with what she was seeing. Sarah could tell this woman held significant authority in the tribe. "This is my grandmother, Desba," Nalnish explained to Sarah. "She asks why I bring white woman to our people." Sarah watched nervously as the conversation continued between Nalnish and his grandmother. The old woman's sharp eyes kept flicking to Sarah, studying her from head to toe as if trying to determine whether she posed a threat to the tribe. Other villagers had gathered around them now, forming a loose circle of curious faces. Sarah noticed that the women stood slightly apart from the men, and that several of them wore expressions of open hostility. She realized that as a white woman, she represented everything their people had been fighting against, the encroachment of settlers onto their ancestral lands. Suddenly, a commotion erupted behind them. Goyal had dismounted and was speaking loudly to anyone who would listen, gesturing angrily at Sarah and Nalnish. Sarah didn't need to understand Apache to know he was stirring up trouble. Several young warriors gathered around Goyal, nodding as he spoke. Sarah could see that he was gaining support for whatever argument he was making against her presence in the village. Desba, the grandmother, watched this development with keen interest. She spoke sharply to Goyal, and he responded with what sounded like a formal challenge. The crowd grew larger as more villagers came to see what was happening. "What is he saying?" Sarah whispered to Nalnish. Nalnish's jaw was tight with anger. "He says I am weak. That I think with heart, not head. He says white woman will bring soldiers to our village." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Sarah realized that Goyal's objection wasn't just personal jealousy. He was raising legitimate concerns about tribal safety that others might share. An older man, clearly someone of importance based on the respectful way others stepped aside for him, joined the growing debate. This was the village chief, Sarah realized, a man whose word would carry more weight than anyone else's. The chief listened carefully as both Nalnish and Goyal presented their arguments. Other villagers occasionally added their voices to the discussion, creating a cacophony of rapid Apache that made Sarah's head spin. During the lengthy debate, Sarah noticed a young Apache woman watching her with particular intensity. The woman was beautiful, with long black hair adorned with colorful beads and wearing a dress of soft buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork. But her eyes held a coldness that made Sarah shiver. Later, Sarah would learn that this woman was Ayana, and that she had been expecting to become Nalnish's wife before Sarah's arrival had complicated everything. As the debate continued, Sarah began to understand that her fate was far from decided. Even though Nalnish had claimed her as his own, the tribe as a whole would have to accept her presence. If they decided she was too great a risk, there would be nothing Nalnish could do to protect her. The sun was beginning to set behind the canyon walls when the chief finally raised his hand for silence. He spoke in measured tones for several minutes, occasionally pointing at Sarah, then at Nalnish, then at Goyal. When he finished speaking, the crowd began to disperse, but Sarah could tell from their expressions that the matter was far from resolved. Many of the villagers looked troubled, and several shot her hostile glances as they walked away. Desba approached Sarah and spoke to her directly in halting English. "You stay in my dwelling tonight. Tomorrow we see if you worthy to live among us." The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She was still on trial for her life, and the next day would determine whether she lived or died. As Nalnish led her toward his grandmother's home, Sarah caught sight of Goyal standing with a group of young warriors near the edge of the village. They were deep in conversation, and their body language suggested they were planning something. She also noticed Ayana watching from the doorway of another dwelling, her beautiful face twisted with an expression of pure hatred. Sarah realized that surviving her capture had been only the beginning of her ordeal. Now she had to prove herself worthy of life among people who had every reason to see her as an enemy, while navigating the dangerous politics of tribal relationships she didn't understand. The night ahead would be long and sleepless, filled with uncertainty about what tomorrow's test would bring. Sarah spent the night huddled on a woven mat in the corner of Desba's dwelling, listening to the sounds of the village settling into sleep around her. The old woman had given her a bowl of stew made with unfamiliar ingredients and a cup of bitter tea, then retired to her own sleeping area without another word. Sleep came in fitful fragments, interrupted by strange dreams and the reality of her situation. Every sound outside made her wonder if Goyal and his supporters had decided to take matters into their own hands, rather than wait for the morning's trial. As dawn broke over the canyon walls, painting the red rocks in shades of gold and orange, Desba shook Sarah awake. The old woman's expression was unreadable as she handed Sarah a set of Apache clothing, a simple buckskin dress and moccasins. "You wear these," Desba said in her limited English. "Show respect for our ways." Sarah changed into the unfamiliar garments, surprised by how comfortable the soft leather felt against her skin. The dress was beautifully crafted, with small decorative beads sewn into intricate patterns around the neckline and sleeves. When they emerged from the dwelling, Sarah saw that the entire village had gathered in the central area. Men, women, and children formed a large circle, with the village chief and several other important-looking individuals positioned at one end. Nalnish stood near the center of the circle, his face painted with ceremonial designs that made him look both fierce and noble. When he saw Sarah approaching in Apache dress, something flickered in his eyes that might have been approval. Goyal was also present, standing with his supporters on the opposite side of the circle from Nalnish. His scarred chest was painted with war symbols, and he carried a ceremonial lance decorated with feathers and beads. The chief began to speak, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. Sarah couldn't understand his words, but she could sense the gravity and formality of the occasion. This was clearly an important tribal ceremony, not just a simple discussion about her fate. Desba positioned herself beside Sarah and began to translate in whispered fragments. "Chief says white soldiers have brought much death to our people. Says our children go hungry because settlers take our hunting grounds. Says we must decide if white woman brings curse or blessing to our tribe." The chief continued speaking for several more minutes, occasionally gesturing toward Sarah. Then he called Goyal forward to present his case against her. Goyal strode to the center of the circle with confident steps. His voice was strong and passionate as he spoke, and Sarah could see that his words were having an effect on many of the listeners. Several people nodded in agreement as he gestured emphatically at her. "He says you are spy," Desba translated grimly. "Says soldiers will follow you here and kill our children. Says Nalnish thinks with man's desire, not warrior's wisdom." When Goyal finished speaking, murmurs of agreement rippled through parts of the crowd. Sarah's heart sank as she realized how many villagers seemed to support his position. Then Nalnish stepped forward to present his argument. His voice was calmer than Goyal's, but no less powerful. As he spoke, he occasionally looked directly at Sarah, and she could hear her name mentioned several times. "Nalnish says you asked to be one of us, not captive," Desba whispered. "Says you have spirit of survivor like Apache women. Says great spirits brought you to him for reason." The debate continued as other villagers were allowed to speak. Some supported Goyal's position that Sarah represented a dangerous risk to tribal safety. Others seemed more open to Nalnish's argument that her presence might serve some greater purpose. Then Ayana, the beautiful woman who had watched Sarah with such hatred the night before, was given permission to speak. Her voice was melodious but filled with venom as she addressed the crowd. Desba's translation became more hesitant. She says Nalnish belonged to her before white woman came. Says white woman uses evil magic to steal him away. Says this brings shame to all Apache women." Sarah felt a flush of embarrassment and anger. She had never tried to steal anyone away, and she resented the implication that she had used some kind of trickery to manipulate Nalnish. But before she could dwell on Ayana's accusations, The chief called for silence and announced what Sarah assumed was the final phase of the trial. 3 large pottery vessels were brought forward and placed in the center of the circle. The chief spoke again, this time directing his words specifically to Sarah. "You must choose," Desba translated, her voice tense. 3 vessels. 1 holds water of life, you drink and live as Apache. 1 holds water of death, you drink and join ancestors. 1 holds water of exile, you drink and leave our lands forever but with protection until you reach white settlements. Sarah stared at the 3 identical vessels, her mouth suddenly dry with fear. The choice before her was literally life or death, but there was no way to know which vessel contained which fate. "How do I choose?" she asked Desba quietly. The old woman's weathered face showed the first hint of sympathy Sarah had seen from her. "You listen to heart. You trust in spirits. You choose with courage." Sarah looked around the circle of faces watching her. Some showed curiosity, others hostility, and a few reflected what might have been pity. Nalnish's eyes met hers across the circle, and she saw both encouragement and helplessness there. He had done everything he could to protect her, but now her fate rested entirely in her own hands. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped forward toward the 3 vessels that would determine whether she lived or died. Sarah stood before the 3 vessels, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone in the circle could hear it. The pottery containers were identical in every way. Same size, same shape, same earth-colored clay. There were no markings or signs to indicate which held life, death, or exile. The silence in the village was complete except for the whisper of desert wind through the canyon. Even the children had stopped their usual chatter, sensing the gravity of the moment. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to calm her racing thoughts. In her mind, she heard her father's voice from years past, telling her that when faced with impossible choices, sometimes the only thing to do was trust in something larger than yourself. When she opened her eyes, she noticed something subtle that others might have missed. The vessel on the left sat slightly differently than the others, as if it had been placed with special care. The one in the middle had a tiny chip on its rim that caught the morning light. The one on the right bore a faint handprint in the clay, so light it was barely visible. Sarah realized these weren't random markers. They were signs left by whoever had prepared the vessels. But what did they mean? Was the special placement of the left vessel meant to guide her toward it or away from it? Was the chip in the middle vessel a warning or an invitation? She looked up and caught Desba watching her intently. The old woman's face remained impassive, but there was something in her eyes that Sarah couldn't quite interpret. Was it guidance, or was Sarah seeing what she hoped to see? Then Sarah noticed something else. Goyal was watching her with barely concealed satisfaction, as if he knew something the others didn't. His confidence suggested he believed the odds were in his favor, that she would choose death or exile rather than life. But Nalnish's expression was different. He stood perfectly still, his painted face showing no emotion, but Sarah could see tension in the way he held his shoulders. He was prepared for whatever choice she made, but she could sense his hope that she would choose wisely. Sarah took a step closer to the vessels and noticed that each one gave off a slightly different scent. The left vessel smelled faintly of sage, a plant she knew was considered sacred by many Native American tribes. The middle vessel had no particular scent that she could detect. The right vessel carried the faint aroma of something Swedish that reminded her of funeral flowers. The Swedish scent made her decision easier. Death often came disguised as something pleasant, and she suspected the right vessel might contain poison rather than simple water. That left the middle vessel and the one that smelled of sage. Sarah remembered her father telling her that sage was used in purification ceremonies and was generally associated with positive spiritual energy. But would the Apache use such an obvious clue? Or would they expect her to think that way and avoid the obvious choice? She looked around the circle one more time, studying the faces of the people who would become her tribe if she chose correctly. These were hard people, shaped by years of conflict and survival in an unforgiving landscape. They wouldn't respect weakness or hesitation. Sarah stepped forward decisively and reached for the middle vessel, the one with the tiny chip in its rim. As her fingers closed around the clay, she felt a collective intake of breath from the watching crowd. She lifted the vessel to her lips, paused for just a moment to send a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening, and then drank deeply. The water was cool and clean, with a slightly mineral taste that suggested it came from a natural spring. As she swallowed, Sarah waited for any sign of what fate she had chosen. Would she feel the burning of poison, the lightness of approaching death, or something else entirely? For a long moment, nothing happened. The village remained silent, and Sarah began to wonder if the test had some other component she didn't understand. Then the chief stepped forward and spoke a single word in Apache. Whatever he said caused the entire crowd to erupt in a mixture of cheers and disappointed murmurs. Desba approached Sarah with what might have been the beginning of a smile on her weathered face. "You chose well, granddaughter," she said, using the Apache term for a young woman who had been adopted into the tribe. "You drank water of life. You are Apache now." Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief, but she forced herself to remain standing. Around her, the villagers were beginning to disperse, some coming forward to touch her hand or speak words of welcome, others walking away with expressions of displeasure. Nalnish approached her, his painted face now showing clear relief and what might have been pride. "You chose with courage," he said quietly. "My grandmother said you would." Sarah looked at Desba with surprise. "You knew which vessel to choose?" The old woman's eyes twinkled with amusement. "I prepared vessels myself. Middle one always holds life is tradition. But tradition also says person being tested must choose without knowing this. You chose with heart, not fear. This makes you worthy." As the crowd continued to thin, Sarah noticed that Goyal had not approached to congratulate her. Instead, he stood with several other warriors at the edge of the circle, their faces dark with anger and disappointment. Ayana was also notably absent from the well-wishers. Sarah caught sight of her retreating to her dwelling, her beautiful face twisted with rage and humiliation. Sarah realized that while she had won the right to live among the Apache, she had also made permanent enemies of people who would be living in the same small village. Her survival was assured for now, but her safety was far from guaranteed. Nalnish seemed to read her thoughts. "You have passed first test," he said quietly. "But becoming true Apache takes time. Some will accept you quickly, others never. You must prove yourself every day." As they walked toward Desba's dwelling, Sarah wondered what new challenges awaited her in this alien world she had chosen to enter. She had survived the test of the vessels, but she suspected that was only the beginning of her trials. The weeks that followed Sarah's acceptance into the tribe brought a grueling education in Apache survival. Desba took personal responsibility for teaching Sarah the skills she would need to contribute meaningfully to village life, and the old woman proved to be a demanding but patient instructor. Each morning before dawn, Sarah was awakened to help gather firewood and fetch water from the spring that fed the village. Her soft hands, accustomed only to the relatively gentle work of frontier homemaking, quickly became rough and calloused from handling rough wood and heavy water containers. Desba taught her to identify dozens of desert plants that could be used for food, medicine, or crafting materials. Sarah learned to grind mesquite beans into flour, to weave baskets from willow branches, and to prepare hides for making clothing and other necessities. The language lessons were perhaps the most challenging part of her education. Apache was unlike any language Sarah had ever heard, with complex tonal variations that completely changed the meaning of words. Desba would patiently repeat phrases over and over, while Sarah struggled to wrap her tongue around sounds that seemed impossible for her mouth to make. But gradually, Sarah began to understand fragments of conversations around her. She learned the names of common objects, basic verbs, and simple phrases that allowed her to communicate her most basic needs. Some of the village women began to warm to her as they saw her making genuine efforts to learn their ways. A young mother named Halona showed Sarah how to properly cook traditional foods, while an elderly woman called Lamasi taught her the intricate beadwork that decorated Apache clothing. However, not everyone was pleased with Sarah's progress. Goyal continued to glare at her whenever their paths crossed, and she often caught him speaking in low, urgent tones with small groups of warriors. She suspected he was still working to turn opinion against her. Ayana's hostility was even more direct. The beautiful woman made a point of demonstrating her superior skills whenever Sarah was learning something new. If Sarah was practicing basket weaving, Ayana would sit nearby creating far more elaborate designs with obvious ease. If Sarah was struggling with language lessons, Ayana would speak rapid, complex Apache that made Sarah feel hopelessly inadequate. More troubling was the way Ayana continued to interact with Nalnish. She would find excuses to seek his advice or assistance, always making sure Sarah could see their interactions. Her message was clear. Regardless of Sarah's new status in the tribe, Ayana still considered Nalnish to be rightfully hers. Nalnish himself seemed caught between competing loyalties. He spent time with Sarah, helping her understand tribal customs and protecting her from the more hostile villagers. But he also maintained his relationships with people like Ayana and even Goyal, trying to prevent Sarah's presence from splitting the tribe apart. The tension came to a head during Sarah's 6th week in the village. She had been working with several other women to prepare food for an upcoming ceremony when she accidentally knocked over a large pot of stew that had been cooking all day. The accident itself wasn't serious, just spilled food that could be replaced. But Ayana seized on the moment to launch into an angry tirade about Sarah's clumsiness and unsuitability for Apache life. "She destroys everything she touches," Ayana declared loudly enough for half the village to hear. "First she destroys Nalnish's judgment, now she destroys our food. What will she destroy next?" Several other women tried to calm the situation, pointing out that accidents happen to everyone, but Ayana wasn't finished. "She brings bad luck to our people," Ayana continued, her voice rising. "Since she came, the hunting has been poor. The rains have not come when they should. The spirits are angry with us for accepting a white woman into our tribe." Sarah felt her face burning with embarrassment and anger. Some of what Ayana said was actually true. The hunting had been less successful recently, and the usual seasonal rains were later than expected. But Sarah knew these were normal variations in desert life, not supernatural punishments. Before Sarah could respond, Desba appeared at her side. The old woman's face was stern as she addressed Ayana in rapid Apache. Sarah couldn't understand all the words, but the tone was clearly a sharp rebuke. Ayana responded angrily, gesturing at the spilled stew and then at Sarah. Other women began to take sides in the argument, with some supporting Ayana's complaints and others defending Sarah's efforts to fit into the tribe. The commotion attracted the attention of men throughout the village, including Nalnish and Goyal. Sarah watched nervously as the two rivals approached. The group of arguing women, Goyal's, expression suggested he was pleased to see conflict erupting around Sarah. This was exactly the kind of disruption he had predicted when he argued against accepting her into the tribe. Nalnish looked troubled as he listened to the various voices raised in argument. Sarah could see him weighing his options. He could defend her publicly, which might further inflame tensions, or he could remain neutral, which might be seen as abandoning her. Before he could decide, the village chief appeared and called for silence. His presence immediately calmed the arguing voices, and everyone waited respectfully to hear what he would say. The chief listened as several people explained what had happened, including both Ayana's accusations and Desba's defense of Sarah. His weathered face showed no emotion as he considered the situation. Finally, he spoke directly to Sarah in careful English. "Ayana says you bring bad fortune to our people. What do you say to this?" Sarah knew that her response to this question could determine whether she remained welcome in the village or found herself exiled to face almost certain death in the desert. Every person in the gathering was watching her, waiting to see how she would handle this direct challenge to her place among them. She took a deep breath and prepared to fight for her life once again, this time with words instead of vessels of water. Sarah looked directly into the chief's eyes as she began to speak, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. She had learned enough Apache over the past weeks to include some phrases in her response, showing respect for their language and culture. "Chief, honored elders, my Apache family," she began, using the formal address Desba had taught her. "I cannot control the rain or the movements of deer, but I can tell you what I have seen since joining your people." She gestured toward Desba, who stood protectively beside her. "I have seen the wisdom of grandmother Desba, who teaches patience to those who struggle to learn. I have seen the skill of Halona, who shared her knowledge of cooking without asking for anything in return. I have seen the kindness of Lamasi, who spent hours teaching me beadwork even though my fingers were clumsy." Several of the women she mentioned nodded approvingly. Sarah could see that her decision to praise specific individuals was having a positive effect on the crowd. "If I bring bad fortune," Sarah continued, "then why have these good things happened since my arrival? Why did old grandfather Taze recover from his fever just 3 days after I came? Why did little Kai learn to walk 2 weeks early, bringing joy to his parents? Why did the warriors return safely from their last hunting expedition, with no injuries and no conflicts with soldiers? This was a calculated risk. Sarah was pointing out positive events that had occurred during her time with the tribe, challenging Ayana's narrative that everything bad could be blamed on her presence. Ayana's face flushed with anger at having her accusations turned around so cleverly. She started to respond, but the chief raised his hand for silence. Sarah wasn't finished. Ayana speaks of tradition and Apache ways. But is it not also Apache tradition to judge people by their actions, not their birth? I did not choose to be born white, just as you did not choose to be born Apache. But I did choose to ask for a place among your people rather than beg for mercy. I chose to drink from the vessel of life rather than seek the easy path of exile. Every day I choose to work harder, learn faster, and prove myself worthy of the trust you have shown me. She paused and looked directly at Ayana. If someone has a problem with my presence here, let them challenge me fairly. Let them test my skills against theirs. Let them prove their accusations with more than just words spoken in anger over spilled food. The crowd murmured with interest. Sarah had just issued what amounted to a formal challenge, something that Apache culture took very seriously. Ayana's eyes blazed with fury, but also with opportunity. You want to be tested? Very well. Tomorrow, before the entire village, we will see who is truly fit to live among the Apache. The chief nodded gravely. It is decided. Tomorrow at sunrise there will be trials to settle this matter. Both women will demonstrate their skills in the traditional tasks that define Apache womanhood. The tribe will judge who has earned their place among us. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror. She had avoided immediate exile, but she had also committed herself to a public competition against a woman who had been raised Apache from birth. Nalnish approached her as the others walked away. His expression was unreadable, but she could see concern in his dark eyes. You have chosen a dangerous path, he said quietly. Ayana is skilled in all the traditional ways. She has been preparing for womanhood her entire life. Sarah nodded, knowing he was right. What choice did I have? If I had remained silent, her accusations would have grown stronger until the tribe believed them. At least this way, I have a chance to prove myself. That evening, Desba spent hours coaching Sarah on the skills she would likely need to demonstrate the next day. They practiced fire-making, hide preparation, plant identification, and cooking techniques until Sarah's hands were raw and her back ached from bending over work. Remember, Desba said as they finally prepared for sleep, this is not just about skill. It is about showing the spirit of an Apache woman. Courage, determination, and grace under pressure matter as much as perfect technique. Sarah lay awake most of the night, listening to the sounds of the village and trying to calm her racing thoughts. Tomorrow would determine not just whether she remained with the tribe, but whether she had any future at all. If she failed these trials, even Nalnish's protection might not be enough to save her from exile or worse. As dawn approached, Sarah heard the village beginning to stir. Today she would either earn her place as a true Apache woman or lose everything she had fought so hard to achieve. She rose from her sleeping mat, dressed in her best Apache clothing, and prepared to face the most important test of her life. The morning sun painted the canyon walls in shades of gold and red, and Sarah chose to see it as a good omen as she walked toward the center of the village where her fate would be decided. The entire tribe had gathered to witness the trials, their faces showing everything from supportive encouragement to skeptical doubt. Ayana stood waiting, confident and beautiful in traditional dress that showcased her skills as a craftswoman. Sarah took her place beside her rival and looked out at the sea of faces watching them. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine whether she truly belonged among these people or whether her desperate gamble had finally reached its end. The chief stepped forward to announce the beginning of the trials, and Sarah prepared to fight once more for the life she had chosen among the Apache.